all of you going along with tonight's webinar. That will also have some links to some other events and upcoming opportunities that we have going on as well. One of those is actually coming up at the end of the month. If you're following us on social media and seeing what we've been sharing recently, one thing that you'll probably have noticed is we are hosting our second annual Women with Vision conference. And that is a virtual online photography conference with all women photographers. So we have 8 women photographers from around the country talking about everything from portraiture, macro, pet photography, nature photography, and more. It's all being hosted by one of our lead educators, Emily Hajnowski. She's an outstanding photographer and just has a great personality. So we're really excited to have her hosting the entire thing. I'll put a link in the chat if anybody wants to check it out. It's a 3-day event, but even if you're not able to make it on all of the days, you'll still get access to the recordings to go back and rewatch afterward as well. And that'll also be in the follow-up email that we have going out. So keep an eye out for that. And that was really the key thing that I wanted to kind of plug today was that event. It's going to be something really special and really exciting. So definitely check it out and sign up if you're able to. I'm really excited that we have David on tonight. I've gotten to work with David a lot over the last few years, especially doing things virtually. We've done a lot of different webinars together for different clubs and groups all around the country, which has been awesome. So you're definitely all in for a treat today with him. And as I mentioned, I will have some specials going along with his webinar. So you'll get that tomorrow or later within a few days as well. That will be sent out to everybody. So those are a couple of things that I wanted to mention. Again, I'll put the link down in the chat to the Women with Vision conference, and I'll also put down my email address. That's always the best way to get a hold of me is via email. If you're looking for anything, have any questions about products or anything else, just shoot me an email and I'll be more than happy to help you out. But with all that being said, Nancy, I'll turn it back to you. And again, just want to thank everybody and looking forward to tonight's program.
Okie dokie, very good. Give me a second to get set up here. Okay. So I'm going to do a little talk on David and then leave the rest to him. But so tonight we have an exciting presentation. Yeah, actually, David, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's DesRochers.
Oh, DesRochers.
Yes.
Very French.
French, yes. French Canadian.
Oh, okay. So anyway, we have an exciting presentation by David from his landscapes, conservation, bird, animal, and flower photography. Okay. David's passion for photography was sparked by a trip to Glacier National Park in the summer of 2000. He was so inspired that he and his wife, Kathy, have traveled the world to experience and document photographically the beauty and wonders of our natural world. David is also an advocate of conservation and became an associate naturalist with the New Jersey Audubon Society. He is also a member of NANPA, which I know I've mentioned before, and that stands for the North American Nature Photography Association. And it does happen to be very active in many different things regarding conservation and encouraging photography and lots of other things, which I'm sure David could be more specific. So in 2015, David published an article on the NANPA website encouraging photographers to consider taking pictures in their own community of areas that are becoming maybe harmful to people, to the environment, and to all living creatures. Now, these kinds of photographs can have a very positive influence in making a change in your community. In the article for NANPA, David mentions the International League of Conservation Photographers, which uses the power of photography to help educate the world community and to further conservation goals. It is something we can do locally, and I will put the link to that article in the chat if you'd like to read it. I will let David tell you more about his work, his flower techniques, and his take on those most important elements of a successful photograph. Our procedure tonight will be the usual. When David's presentation begins, we'll turn off everyone's sound so we don't accidentally hear anything uncensored. And we would appreciate if you would all turn off your video, which can also be a distraction. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. If they would best be answered during the presentation, I will be monitoring the chat and David will address them during a pause. Otherwise, he will answer them at the question and answer time at the end. So it's presentation time, and I will hand over the Zoom stage to the talented professional photographer, David DesRochers.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Nancy. And nice to see Noah again. I've been working and Noah Hunts has been supporting me since I started shooting about 20 years ago, and I've had a long-standing relationship with him. So I can, if I'm going to buy equipment, that's where I go. So I definitely would recommend the service they give, and the prices are competitive. So yeah, definitely a great partner for me over the years. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. Okay.
Sounds great.
Screen share, and there goes my. So I'm going to turn off my camera. I don't think you need to see me.
Oh, we like seeing you.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me just kind of minimize it up here, and then I'm going to hide this little
Here we go.
floating controls. Okay, so there we are. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about photographing, flowers, botany, anything that grows out of the earth. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight will encompass shooting indoors, tabletop type of setups, but I also do a lot of photography outside, and I'll address some challenges that you face when photographing flowers out of doors. So to get started, you really can shoot flowers with any type of a camera. I live in an over 55 community, and we have a little camera club here, and I would say half the people shoot with their smartphones, and they get pretty nice, decent pictures. I'm more of a purist, and I tend to zoom in 100% on all my photos, so I want to definitely see some good quality images. So that's why I use a digital SLR. I have a Canon 5D and a mirrorless Olympus camera that I shoot with. But whether you're shooting with a phone, a point and shoot, a bridge camera, or a high-end camera, all the understandings of light and composition, they all apply. So it's not so much about the tool that you're using, it's more about how you use that tool and how you understand the principles of photography. When I shoot flowers, I use probably a standard zoom lens, 100 to 24 to 105, a 12 to 100 on my Olympus, and I'll sometimes use macro lenses as well. I do not consider myself an expert macro photographer, so I won't spend too much time talking about that. But what I would suggest is, at the end of this program, I will be sending out some notes that kind of back up what I'm talking about tonight. And one of the things in those notes is a link to this Neil Fisher YouTube video, an introduction to macro photography. And if you haven't done macro, this is a great introduction to learn about macro photography, what it can do for you, and give you an understanding of the challenges that you would face you doing macro photography. Tripods, I always use a tripod, very seldom handhold a shot, and unless I'm facing with certain challenges as far as position of the plant or windy conditions. But for the most part, I try to use a tripod all the time. The idea is you want to get your subject sharp, and even with my landscape photography, I always use a tripod, not only because it steadies your camera, but also having your camera on a tripod helps you study your subject a little bit more. As opposed to lifting up your camera and pointing at something and taking the shot. When you have it on a tripod, you start thinking more about your composition, the lighting, and it makes you more thoughtful before you actually hit the shutter button. If you're using a smartphone, they have tripods for smartphones too. So you don't get away with not using a tripod if you're a phone shooter, but you can pick up something for that as well. So camera settings, we have a whole bunch of photographers here, and I'm sure you think about your camera settings all the time, as I do. So what I would suggest is to always use the lowest ISO setting possible. For my indoor photography, I'm really not challenged with wind or other elements that would require a faster shutter speed. So my real big concern with when I'm shooting is to set my aperture and really focus on the aperture that I'm using to get the depth of field that I'm trying to get in the photograph. I always shoot in RAW. If you're not a RAW shooter and you're shooting in JPEG, I would suggest you talk to more experienced members of your club, and I'm sure they can really talk about the benefits. But bottom line is, when you're shooting in RAW, you're capturing a heck of a lot more data on that sensor than you would be if you were shooting in JPEG. I always shoot aperture priority, and if on my DSLR, I always use live view. And of course, if I'm using my mirrorless camera, I've got that screen on the back of the camera that I like to compose using that as opposed to looking through the viewfinder. The things that every photographer should understand, and I'm not going to go into a bunch of technical stuff about the exposure triangle, but you've got three settings that are going to change your photograph significantly. You've got your aperture, which is going to affect depth of field as well as exposure. Your ISO is going to be indicating how sensitive your sensor is. And of course, your shutter speed, how long your shutter is open to take the shot. So basically, fast shutter speed, the less light, the longer the shutter speed, the more light you're getting in. And if you're shooting indoors, your shutter speed is really not anything to be concerned about. But if you're outdoors and you've got a little bit of a wind blowing your subjects, then shutter speed becomes even more important. And you have to select a shutter speed that will be fast enough to freeze the motion of your subject. Aperture, again, the smaller aperture number, f1.4, the wider your aperture is, it lets in more light. You close down your aperture, say to f16, you're letting less light in, and you're also doing something else. You're increasing the depth of field that you're capturing. How much of your image is going to be sharp from front to back? So what I would suggest is, when you go to a garden, and just fool around with your apertures to kind of see what happens to your background. And I'm going to talk more about background in a few minutes, but you really want your background not to compete with your subject, but to support and reinforce your subject. So in this case, this was shot at Longwood Gardens, one of my favorite gardens. And at f32, you can see my subject is sharp, but you can also see an out of focus, yet some detail in my background. Same flowers, and that's what I was trying to achieve. I wanted the companion flowers of this subject to be in my background. I go down to f14, my subject is still sharp, but now you can see the background starts blurring even further. And then at f8, it blurs further even more. So my preference with my style of photography is I like the shot that I shot at f8. Just enough color and just enough shape to tell the viewer that the flowers in the background are the same one that is the featured subject in this photograph. Love your histogram. The most important thing that you want to look at in your camera after you take your shot is not the photograph, it's the histogram. And the histogram is going to tell you whether you've captured the data that you're trying to capture in your photograph. I always tend to shoot to the right. And what that means is I want my histogram all the way to the right without going off the edge. That gives me more data to work with in post-processing. It's also important with flowers to also look at your color histogram. Because you can see in this example, if you look at the luminosity histogram of this photograph, you can see that it looks like it's well captured. It's not off the edge on the right, not off the edge on the left. But if you look at the color histogram, you can see that the red channel is all the way to the right. And if you look at the photograph, you can see the reds are so saturated that we're losing detail. And that is very typical when shooting red flowers or yellow flowers. So here's an example. This is a tulip. You can see you've got the red and yellows in there. And if you look at the reds, you see red, but you don't see any detail there. You can't really see the grain in the petals. Now, if I look at my luminosity histogram, it looks fine. But if I look at my color histogram, you can see the reds are off the chart. I have lost all detail in my reds. even though my luminosity histogram is telling me that everything is okay. So watch your reds and watch your yellows. So with all types of photography, it's all about the light. So how do you illuminate your subject? Well, there's all kinds of opportunities here, all kinds of different equipment that you can use. What I will tell you is don't use a pop-up flash on your camera. That's probably the worst source of light that you can use, because what's going to happen is all that light is going to be it's going to illuminate the subject from one direction. And as a result, it tends to create shadows behind the subject. The light is flat. So you really have very little control on the direction of the light when you're using your pop-up flash. I would avoid that altogether. You want to try to use balanced ambient light to fill in shadows. So what I would normally do is usually a flash that I can put on top of my camera. But by using one of these cords, I take that flash off my camera. Now I can move that flash around and change the direction of the light. I tend to try to avoid front lighting on all my subjects. I try to illuminate them from different angles, and I'll show you some examples in a few minutes. So you can either use a cord, or you can have a wireless setup where you don't need a cord at all and just have a transmitter on your camera and a receiver on your flash. And then the camera will speak to the flash via a wireless connection. I also like to try to diffuse the light when I'm using a flash. So there's all kinds of diffusers and reflectors that you can get that go on top of the flash. So the top one on the upper right, I think it's called a Gary Fong diffuser. Mostly used by wedding photographers and portrait photographers, but I find it also works really well with flowers. So something to diffuse the light is that flash coming off is very harsh. It's almost having a little sun on your camera, and you tend to get harsh shadows. So by diffusing the light, it softens that light and gives you a nicer look on your subject. I don't own one of these, but if you like indoor photography, this is something that you can probably pick up for not too much money, kind of a little studio that you can put your plants in. I don't use this, but I do like to mention it because it is an option for indoor photography. Now, when you're outdoors, this is where the light gets really challenging. So just imagine being outdoors at a garden, photographing your flowers. The sun is up, nice and bright. So what happens to your flowers? You get all these harsh and unsightly shadows. So the way I manage light when I'm doing an outdoor photography shoot is with a deflector or reflectors or diffusers. And these devices redirect or alter the amount of light direction of existing light. So for example, here I am out at a local garden. And so in order to get the light on my subject, I've got the bright sun coming down directly behind my my flower. So you can see at the top right, you see the no reflector shot. You can see that I exposed for the white flowers, but then the flowers below that are not being illuminated by the sun are very dark. But by using a reflector and bouncing the sunlight back onto the flower, so now the flower is evenly illuminated, as you can see on the bottom right. So you've got good light on the top and good light on the bottom. So reflecting existing light is a nice way to control the light when you're shooting outdoors in bright sunshine. Portrait photographers do this technique all the time when they're shooting outdoors. So just consider your flower as a model, and you'll feel the same enjoyment. Okay. Here's another example. This is actually indoors at Longwood Gardens. It's in their arboretum, but you can see the sunlight is coming in through the ceiling. They have the glass ceilings to let the sunlight in to light the plants. So you can see the top of the plant is kind of harsh. The light is very bright, where the bottom of the plant is a little dark. So by using a diffuser, I block the sunlight coming onto the flower. And now I have this nice soft light A little bit of brightness on the top, a little shadow on the bottom, but a lot closer in luminosity than the shot without the diffuser. And of course, by using the diffuser, I also slowed down my shutter speed. And as a result, instead of a dark background, the longer shutter speed was able to expose the background, which is that beautiful green, which were, I think it might have been the grass or some green plants that were way in the distance, and now were rendered totally out of focus because I used a shallow depth of field. If you're a macro shooter, you may want to invest in a twin light or these ring lights. I had a twin light. I ended up selling it. It's good if you like doing insect photography. I know somebody mentioned that earlier. A twin light can be really helpful because it allows you to really illuminate and direct the light. You can change the output of each of the flashes, so you can have a little bit stronger light on one and a little less on the other. And these are really they really come in handy when doing insect photography. What I would advise you, though, they're not cheap. I think this Canon flash now goes for like $700. So they're not a cheap piece of equipment, but if that's your passion, something to consider. I would also go select a twin light over a ring light. It gives you more manageability. This is my choice. Doing indoor or outdoor photography. These LumeCube panels, these are LED light panels. And I started using a Manfrotto similar product many years ago, and I've since added the LumeCube to my arsenal. And it's really great because it allows you to illuminate the subject, but because it's a handheld device, you can kind of move that light around to really, before you take the shot, analyze what the light direction is needed in order to get the kind of shot that you're looking for. So for example, here's a tulip that's set up in my house. So I take the light and I start moving it around. And as I'm moving it around, you can see that some of the flowers aren't illuminated enough, so I know I need a little bit more light. You can see that some of the flowers have a shadow behind the bulb right on the leaf that are unsightly. So I keep moving it around until I get the angle that eliminates all the dark shadows and effectively illuminates my subject. So that's one of the advantages of the LumeCube, is that it really lets you model your lighting before you take the shot. Oh, that's the final shot that I took, holding that LumeCube exactly in just the right spot. Backlighting. Flowers really work out nicely when they're being lit from behind. They're translucent, so you get all that light kind of coming through those petals, and it kind of makes them glow. And I try to take advantage of that situation as often as I can. So here's an example. Here's a leaf from a lotus flower. This is down at Grounds for Sculpture, which is a beautiful sculpture garden here in New Jersey. And they have a lotus garden. So I took a photograph facing the leaf. It's being illuminated by the sun. But I walk behind the leaf and shoot through the leaf. And all of a sudden, you've got that beautiful glow. You've got the detail in the veins of the leaf. And I think this is a much more pleasing image than when it's being directly illuminated by the sun. So think about shooting through leaves, flowers, let that light come through and use that to kind of enhance the overall appearance. You can create your own backlighting. I was doing a photo shoot at a local flower shop, or a garden shop. And a friend of mine says, let me illuminate that for you. And he went behind it with a flashlight. So this is a part on the center here is being illuminated by a little flashlight. So it gives you that little glow coming in from behind the plant. And then I illuminated the front using a little bit of fill flash. So again, it's always balancing direction of light, intensity of light, to get the exact look and feel that you're looking for. Combine natural and artificial light. So I do a lot of work on my dining room table, and I have sunlight coming in through the window to illuminate it. And then I combine that natural light with a little fill light using one of my LED lights. So by using a light in that position, I'm able to eliminate those shadows and come up with a picture that would be a little bit more appealing than having all those shadows in your composition. Okay, so that's kind of the lighting thing that has to do with outdoors or indoors. So remember, when you're out there shooting, especially when you're outdoors, your biggest challenge is going to be the wind and the sunlight. So with the sunlight, reflectors and diffusers do a great job. For wind, here's where knowing what shutter speed you're going to need to freeze the action. So this is where you need to understand how shutter, aperture, and ISO work together to give you the right exposure at the right shutter speed. So selecting your subjects. So I go to the supermarket or home store or garden shop and I buy flowers. And before I plant them in my garden, I bring them inside and I do the setups that I like to do indoors. I try to look for perfection. I look for plants that are at or before their peak. I try to avoid flowers with spots and tears and missing petals. And I try to capture stages of life. Let's look at a couple of examples. So this is at Longwood Gardens. I took this photograph specifically for this presentation to show you kind of what I would suggest you kind of walk by. There's really nothing interesting about this flower. You can see the petals are deteriorating. There's holes in the petals. Not a very nice specimen. But I took a couple of steps down the pathway and found its sister, which was right at its prime. So you can see the sister that is at peak is a lot more appealing. Now, this might seem obvious to most of you, but I've judged photo competitions for years, and I can't tell you how many times people have put flowers in that are kind of falling apart, just not really a most beautiful specimen. Stages of life, a bud before it blooms can be as interesting and beautiful as a full blooming flower. Here's an example. I took a photo of this behind the flower. So I've got the full bloom flower from behind and then a bud just coming to life. So the combination is like a mother and a child when I look at this. And then disregard everything I just said and get really creative with really, really dead plants. So what am I saying? Dead plants. Why do you want to photograph a dead plant? Well, first of all, I think they're kind of pretty. These were some dead flowers that were on my back porch one summer. They were all, past their prime, falling apart. So I picked them up. I arranged them on a light box that I used to use for my slide film. And I thought it made as interesting a picture as if they were brand new, healthy flowers. I found this leaf on my driveway, and I was just fascinated not only by the subtle color changes, but by the curves and the angles. And to me, this just flowed so beautifully. So again, I just picked it up, put it on my light box, and I like this. I think this works nicely. I like the fact that it's past its peak, but there's so much interest in it, the veins and the colors. And so look for things that are not necessarily fresh and full of life, but some of these plants that are a little bit past their prime are really on the way out. I went out in the field and I grabbed some of these. These were old, I guess, old thistles after they had died off. This was in the fall. And you go out in the field where we have a lot of our wildlife sanctuaries here in New Jersey. And you walk the field and you get all these dead plants. So I picked a couple of them and brought them home. So now when people look at it, they say, why are you photographing a dead plant like this? Well, one other thing I want to point out, I'm using this little clamp, this little device here to hold it up. This comes in handy when using, it's also going to work in the field and holding your flowers steady if you've got some wind. But anyways, I just thought this was beautiful. So I arranged it and took the picture. And I think this is, now for me anyways, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But to me, this is interesting. I think there's some subtle beauty in this arrangement of plants. And I could see that being printed out on a metal print and hung on a wall next to something similar on the shelf. Okay, composition. What to think about when you're composing your image. First suggestion, get familiar with the color wheel and understand how colors work together. Complementary colors such as red and green, yellow and purple. And when you combine those colors in your photograph, they create strong contrast and they kind of reinforce each other. Now you don't have to stick to, if it's not primary, if it's not complementary colors, don't take the picture. That's not what I'm saying. But if you do recognize it, take advantage of it. So here's a ginger flower from Costa Rica. And so you can see the red flower with the green background. So those are complementary colors. And I think it helps to really make the main subject stand out. So I talked a little bit about macro. So what would you use a macro for? Well, to get in close and really get the fine detail of some of these plants. Instead of taking the whole plant, there's some interesting detail within that plant, and that's what we should focus on. But understand that when you're using a macro lens, you've got a very shallow depth of field. So for example, 100 millimeter macro lens at its closest working distance, which is 12 inches, your depth of field is 0.07 inches. That's not a lot. At f32, now you're getting as much depth of field out as you can. Your depth of field is only 0.3 inches. So even though you've added all that, depth of field with your f-stop, because the way macro lenses work and you're close to your subject, your depth of field is very, very shallow. So what can you do about it? Well, here's a couple of solutions. First of all, keep your subject on a flat plane, as flat a plane as possible. So as opposed to shooting it on an angle, you want the flower to be flat and parallel with your sensor, so you don't have a lot of depth of field to cover. Increase your distance away from the subject. The further back you are, the more depth of field you're going to get. So sometimes it's better off just being further back, take a photograph, and then crop it. And if you crop it too much and you need to upsize it, there's a program by Topaz Labs called Gigapixel, which would take that image and then resize it up. And not only does it resize it, but it also improves the image. Consider focus stacking, and I'm going to talk a little bit about doing that in a few minutes. And of course, you want to buy a tilt shift macro lens. Costs a lot of money. You probably won't use it that often, but it is an option to increase depth of field for flower photography. So here's an example, just getting in close as opposed to taking a photo of the whole flower. I'm going in here and just zeroing in, and I really was fascinated by all the petals as they kind of curve and all kind of start looking into the center of the flower. It's almost like there's a crowd trying to get to the center where all the action is. This is a form of sunflower. This was done outside at a local garden, a place called Willowwood, one of our favorite spots to photograph. And this was just a little flower, and it's not very big. It's not as big as the main, the bigger sunflowers. But again, I went in really, really close. I kept the flower on a flat plane, so my depth of field was minimized. And for this particular shot, I think kind of a symmetrical presentation kind of worked. It's opposed to having, the center off center like most photographic judges try to get you to do. I thought this worked best if the center of the flower was dead center and then the petals were kind of streaming off of it. Again, another flower taking out a local garden. Fortunately, not a windy day. So I shot this at f32. I was on a tripod. The flower wasn't moving. And as a result, I've got most of the flower pretty tack sharp. But then by reducing your depth of field, I wanted this flower to really focus on the center of the flower, and then I wanted the rest of the flower to go soft. So I used my focal point, focused on the center of the flower, used a smaller or a wider aperture, which lessened my depth of field. So my center is sharp, but then the other flowers closest to me, the petals are more out of focus. Oh, that's kind of what they call selective focusing. And you can do, this is a great thing to do on any flower photography, is just find a small section of the flower that you want to emphasize and let everything else go out of focus. Okay, backgrounds. What you put behind your subject is just as important as your subject. So natural backgrounds, let's talk a little bit about that. This was indoors. This is a place called Duke Farms, and they have an orchid house. So I was photographing in the orchid house, but because it's more for displaying the plants as opposed to photographing them, whenever I saw a beautiful flower, it had something very distracting in the background. So I did find this one orchid, and I was able to position myself by getting down low. There was a window way above my head. It was high up in the building. So I lowered myself down so I could use that window and the blue sky outside as my background. Simplify the background, emphasize my subject. And it was very easy to then take that photograph, take it in Photoshop, crop it, do a little editing. So now I have the flower is the main subject with the blue sky behind it. Out in California, shooting in a poppy field. And here's like similar to what I showed you earlier. I wanted other poppies to be in the background of the main subject, but I wanted them to be out of focus. So in this shot, a little bit of a windy day. So look at my shutter speed, 1/800th of a second. I needed a fast shutter speed to freeze the action so the wind would not blur the flower. And then I got down low, as you could see me laying on the ground. And at f6.3, I had a shallow depth of field, blurred the background. And of course, I had to raise my ISO from 100 to 400 in order to get that 1/800th of a second shutter speed. So you can see how those work together. In order to get the faster shutter speed, in some cases, you need to raise your ISO to help facilitate that faster shutter speed. Another thing you can do if you want to get that effect is take a picture of a garden. In this case, this was the tulip garden that we have here in New Jersey. So I just took a small section of it. In post-processing, I blurred it to make it look out of focus. Then I printed it on velvet fine art paper. The reason I use that type of paper, it's not shiny. It's a matte finish, so you don't get that shine that you would on glossy or semi-gloss. And then I would use that as a background in my house to make you think that I was outside. And of course, I was doing this during COVID when we weren't going anywhere. We were kind of stuck in our condo at the time. And but this is something you can do. You can take and you can even take these types of pictures with you when you're shooting outside. So if you're shooting at a tulip garden and you've got distracting elements behind, you can just stick one of these pictures behind to create a pleasing background. When things aren't going well in the field, I take out of focus pictures, and I do it on purpose. Why? Okay, I do it because I want backgrounds. So these are backgrounds that I can use either in post-processing, or I can print them out as I showed you previously and bring them with me. And if I have a subject that I'm struggling to get a decent background on, but I really want to capture that subject, I can just put this on a piece of cardboard, put it behind my subject, and instantly I have an out of focus background. So I'm talking a little bit about out of focus background. So why am I emphasizing that? It's really important to take your photograph of your subject and make sure that the background isn't competing for the attention for the viewer. You want your main subject to stick out and not have other elements of the flower interfering with drawing at the attention of the viewer someplace else in the image. So I tend to try to work and position myself to always get a background that is supportive and pleasing and doesn't distract from my subject. High key and low key. You've probably seen pictures like that. I love doing these. I like the look of it. You know, the bright pictures with high key with a whiteboard. Low key, you can get a blackboard. You can pick these up at any art store. These are 99 cents a piece. At least they were a few years back. And you can use these as your background. Other things I'll use is either black or white velvet. You know, the velvet also gives that nice texture. So sometimes if you want a little bit of a texture to that background, the velvet would be a better choice in that area. So here's an example: high key on the left, low key on the right. So on the left picture on the left, I use a white mat board, and I'll show you how I illuminated the setup in a minute. But here again, your picture's bright, your flowers are bright, and then the poppy on the right, that was taken at Longwood Garden. Again, there were distracting elements behind the flower. So I brought along I had a velvet or a fleece vest, and I just put the fleece vest behind it, creating a black background. And so it allows that flower to stand out, and all the distractions that were there in real time were magically eliminated. So here's an example of how I can set up a high key shot or low key shot. This was done on the flowers were placed in a vase on a chair. The black velvet was draped over the chair. I positioned the flowers so the sunlight was coming in from the window, which was above the chair. So it had the sunlight coming in the back, illuminating the back of the flowers. And then using a handheld flash, I use a very low setting to just fill in a little bit of the shadows to create a nicely exposed image, but with some subtle shadows to create texture and depth. And here is the final image. So light coming from behind, light coming from the side, creating very subtle shadows. And then of course, because it's a yellow flower, I have to reduce the yellow channel in order to reduce all that blown out saturation that you would get normally in a yellow flower. And I'll show you how I do that in a few minutes. So when doing high key, what I would normally do is I would find something to illuminate the background. I want the white background to be totally blown out, no color, totally white. So by illuminating the background with more light than I'm throwing on my subject, gives me a good exposure on my subject and gives me a solid white background. And that's the result. So again, I'm illuminating the background, the white background. In this particular case, it was one of the white mat boards. You illuminated that with a flash and then used the LED light to illuminate the flower. Change your angle. Get creative. So this is an outdoor shot. I was at actually it was an alpaca farm. I was bringing my granddaughter to go see the alpacas, but of course they had a beautiful garden. So I walked around with my camera and took some shots. On this shot, I'm laying on the ground. I'm sure people thought I was crazy, but I laid down so I was below the flower. And then I used the sky as my background. And I kind of liked a little bit of clouds that I had over on the left-hand side. Same garden, again, laying on the ground. Instead of taking a picture of the front of the flower, I thought the back of this flower was even more interesting. So I'm taking a picture of just the back of the flower. Again, laying on the ground. Poppies are very popular. We get a period of time in the spring when Longwood Gardens has a collection of poppies, and they're beautiful flowers. You know, I photograph them from the front, I photograph them from the back, but get in even closer, and just the detail of the stem and the beautiful colors and the veins in the petals themselves even a little bit of pollen there. So don't be afraid to get in close and take several shots of your subject. Don't take take your front shot, take a side shot, take a back shot, zoom in, get in close, and just take all different types of angles to give yourself more choices when you get home. You might find that one of the choices you made is your favorite. Gabir daisy, again, from behind. The sun is illuminating it, so the sun is coming through the petals. And of course, I overexposed it, so the background is blown out and in white. Let it rain. Adding a little bit of water to your plants can add a little bit more interest. So what I sometimes do on my own plants is to spray them, get a little spray bottle of water and just create my own raindrops. Now, I caution you, do not do this at a public garden. One of the things that can happen is if you spray these flowers and the sun comes out and the sun starts beating on those beads of water, they'll end up burning the petals of the flowers. So this is something you should do in your own garden or in your own home, but don't do this in a public garden. Of course, if it naturally rains, and you have a chance to get out there, then obviously that's the time to get real rain on your flowers. Another example of a close-up of a tulip, just the edge of the tulip with the raindrops on it. Take pictures of clusters of flowers. So instead of a single flower, look for patterns. In this particular case, I have I've got kind of a little curve. I'm kind of attracted to this flower, the little one in the middle, and then the one on the upper right. Kind of creates a nice little C curve. And then the other flowers are a little bit darker. So look for clusters, and within those clusters, look for interesting patterns. And of course, look for the star of the show. There might be one flower within that cluster that you may want to feature. So you can do that by either, post-processing and making it a little brighter, adding a little bit more contrast to it. But doing clusters of flowers, I think, are really, really enjoyable to do. And I think they make a nice photograph. Tell a story. So many years ago, I saw a gentleman by the name of Mike Moats. He's kind of the tiny world photography guru. And he does, I believe it's from Michigan. He does a lot of macro photography and nature details out in the woods and so forth. And he told a story about how he wanted to, he kind of encouraged you to look for something more than just the perfect flower. Look for something that tells a story. I had this up for a few minutes, and as you look at this image, kind of ask yourself, what do you see? What can you interpret? And what I interpret on this shot is I interpret 3 different tulips with significantly different personalities. The one tulip that's orange and yellow, that's all the way kind of peeking out behind the leaf of the other tulip, I kind of look at that as the shy tulip. Then the tulip in the middle with its arms raised up is saying, look at me, aren't I wonderful? And then the other tulip, of course, is a lot more thoughtful. And it's got its petal under its chin, and it's thinking about what these other 2 characters are doing. So that's kind of what I saw when I photographed this. And so I hope you can kind of see what I'm seeing and think about it next time you go out. Look for stories like that. Look for how flowers are maybe relating to each other or how they're leaning against each other, and see if you can come up with a similar story. Still life, if you like still life photography, work the flowers into it. This was a rose. I had bought my wife roses for Valentine's Day one year. And of course, as roses do, they started dying off. But then I clipped them and I used those dead roses, or the ones that were dying, and then kind of paired them up with some still life elements, in this case, a candle. And then I photographed the candle just as I blew out the flame, and the smoke from the wick was rising up. Again, using an LED light and just painting this scene with the camera. It's not a steady light. I'm painting it, I'm moving it around. Okay, now you want to get out there and do some really crazy stuff. I'm going to show you a couple of creative things that I like to do when I'm photographing outdoors. First of all, intentional camera motion. So what is that? Well, basically, what we're going to do is to contradict everything we were ever taught about photography. And instead of coming back with a very sharp, detailed image, you're going to come back with a blurred image. So why do you want to do that? Well, by moving your camera slightly up and down, I find that you can get some really interesting images that look more like a painting than they do a photograph. I've done this in several gardens. They work great when you're in a garden and you've got several flowers, different shades of light. Here you've got some shadows, you've got some midtones, you've got some bright areas. And just again, moving that camera ever so slightly up and down with your shutter speed shutter open, maybe a half a second to a second to 2 seconds. It doesn't really matter. You can fool around with that shutter speed. Excuse me, but it gives you something more of a painted look, a painterly look than that sharp photograph type of feel. Zooming in and zooming out. Okay, here I want to be on a tripod. I focus on the center of the flower. And then as I hit the shutter button, I zoom out. And the shutter, in this case, it was 1/13 of a second. So I zoomed very quickly and it creates this zoom effect. And of course, I post-process that I kind of move that center down to the lower third of the image, following those compositional rules. And a similar technique is called turn. So you can turn the camera while it's on a tripod. Here you would need a lens that could fix itself to the tripod. So as you turn the camera, the shot is steady. So you'll need one of these collars on your lens, and then you loosen that collar, and then as the shutter is open, you just turn the camera, and that looks something like that. So these are fun to do, whether you think they're beautiful images or you'd want to hang them on your wall. That would be your individual choice, but I find them a lot of fun to do. And every now and then you get a surprise and you get an image that says, wow, this really looks cool to me. And again, remember, that's what you're shooting for. You're shooting for yourself. And if you find something, a technique that works and is giving you something different than what you do every single day, then I would encourage you to try it. Multiple exposures. I kind of think of this as my Monet photography technique. I have the instructions in my notes on how to do this, so I'm not going to read all the detail on the settings, but here's a couple of examples. So this is a multiple exposure. I was thinking it's probably about 6 exposure. And here again, instead of moving the camera, I take a shot, I move the camera ever so slightly, take another one, and then move it ever so slightly, take another one. And there's no set pattern. You just kind of move it, little smooth movement, and then just around the area. And what it does is it multiplies all the pictures and then blends them together in the camera. Okay, a couple of editing techniques that I would like to share. First of all, I talked a little bit about the red and yellow, how they tend to oversaturate. So this is what I would normally do in that scenario. So here again, I have a photograph here of a bleeding heart, and this is out of the camera. And you can see that the really, really intense red and magenta there, I really don't have a lot of detail there. So what I would normally do is I would desaturate that color channel. So if it's a magenta, I'd take the magenta channel down. If it's a red, then I would take the red channel, and this is all in hue saturation. And by removing that extra color, all of a sudden you can see the detail in the flower. And I think this is a lot more appealing than something like this that's oversaturated. And of course, the results are something like this. So if you see colors and the colors seem really, really bright, and under that color you don't see detail, don't be afraid to just pull down that channel. Again, I go to hue saturation. If red is being blown out, I take the red channel, I desaturate the red, and then all this detail then comes out. So special effects I like to play with. This is called the Orton effect. You can do this in Photoshop or in camera. In my notes, I do have instructions on how to do it in Photoshop. Basically, what it is taking a flower, and here's a one that I've got illuminated from the front. So I'm shooting the back of it, so the light is coming through the flower. But then by using the Orton effect, I add a little bit of a glow. So all of a sudden, I've got a little glow on that flower. So this is before, and this is after. So it's a kind of look that I like. Not everybody likes this kind of a look, but I would suggest that you grab a couple of flowers, fool around with the technique, and see if it works for you. These are the instructions. I won't go through them in detail now, but again, these are in my notes, and you can check them out when I get those notes sent out later tonight.
Awesome.
Okay. You can also do the same Orton effect in camera. Again, I have instructions for this, but this is a water lily here back at Longwood Gardens again. And what you would do is you would take one picture, you have two exposures. You take the first picture, sharp, then you take your focus ring and you make it blurring, turning to counterclockwise. And so you're focusing and you're kind of zooming out a little bit. You take your second shot out of focus, then the camera merges those two images together and it gives you something like that. So as you can see, it's got that glow effect, and that's what I'm trying to achieve here. So you can do this in camera, or you can do it in post-processing in Photoshop. Okay, my phone is ringing. Hopefully my wife will get it. Okay, focus stacking. I was talking about this earlier. One of the challenges with photographing flowers with a macro lens, or even sometimes with your 24 to 105 lens, is getting the entire image in focus. So today, fortunately, there are a lot of cameras on the market that will do this automatically for you. You just have to know where to find it in the very complex menus that are available on these cameras. But basically what they'll do is they'll take the picture, you tell them how many shots you want to take, you take the focal point in one spot, and then the camera knows how to take several pictures in front and several pictures behind, and then in camera blends them together to create one image that is in focus. So this is an example of one that I did. These flowers were on my out in my front yard, and so they were pretty a lot of depth of field to cover here, and I couldn't get it all sharp in one image. But by using the in-camera focus stacking, I was able to get the entire flower in focus. If you don't have a camera that does that, you can do it manually. And the way you do that is you take a series of photos while gradually changing the focal point. So your camera must be on a tripod. You can use manual or autofocus. I tend to use autofocus. I'll let the focus point dictate the correct focus. My eyes aren't that good anymore, so I have to rely on the camera to be my focus director. And then of course the aperture, I usually set my aperture at f8, f11. That's kind of the sweet spot for many of the lenses. So here's an example. This is an orchid, again, back at Longwood Gardens. So I'll take 4 shots on this image. So I take one shot, I focus on the front of the camera, on the front of the flower, take a second one, a few inches up, the third one, a few more inches up, and then the fourth one at the back of the flower. So if you look at shot number 1, you can see the front of the flower is sharp, but the back is way out of focus. The number 4 image I took, the front is out of focus, but you can see the back is sharp. So by taking these into Photoshop, and again, I won't go through the directions, they're in my notes, but you would just basically take these into Photoshop, load the files into Photoshop layers, and then in Photoshop, you would merge those together, going auto blend layers, stack images, and voila, you've got a flower that is sharp from front to back. Not very difficult to do. It's easy to capture, and as you can see, it's relatively easy to process. One more technique I've been fooling around with that I think kind of creates something interesting. Another orchid here. Interesting orchid, but kind of, this is the raw image. It's flat lighting. Didn't have any interesting light to work with on this subject. So I create my own. And basically, I'm taking this flower and adding a little spotlight to it. And I'll show you, it's very easy to do in post-processing. So now you've got something, I think it's interesting. To me, this looks like a little alien. You've got the kind of like wings here. He's got a little bow tie on, got a big nose, he's got big ears, and he's got little funny feet. So that's what I see in flowers. I see aliens. Okay, so here's how you do it. Again, in my notes, in Camera Raw, you can do this. You can take a radial filter and just circle the area that you want to focus on. And then you invert that radial filter and then basically take the exposure down on every area except the center of the flower. And that gives you that kind of what I call spotlighting appearance. And that's what it would look like. Again, these were taken outside at one of our flower or our sunflower farms here in New Jersey. We have several of them, and more of the farms are doing sunflowers because there's a lot of photographers here in New Jersey that love to do them. And of course, I got my little friend the bug on the little bee on there as well. And finally, texture overlay. I could probably do a whole workshop on this one. I'm not a super expert on texture overlays, but I have done a few, and it's something else to consider. Again, you really have to have more of a Photoshop skill level that would allow you to understand how to use textures, blend layers, and so forth. But if you haven't done this before and you're somewhat proficient at Photoshop, in my notes, I have a YouTube video a link to a YouTube video that explains how to do this. There's also a woman called Hazel Meredith, who is outstanding at doing layers. And she also does workshops and so forth and online tutorials. So texture overlays are another way to give it your flower images a little bit more of an artistic feel. Finally, if you're not a botanist, I'm not a botanist. I have trouble identifying plants, unfortunately. But there are apps out there, one of them being Plant Snap, where you take a picture of the plant and then it comes back and tells you what it is. I found that it works 50% of the time. I know I took a picture of an orchid once and it came back as something else. So it doesn't always work. I'm sure as time goes on, they're improving the quality of these apps. But again, if you don't know the name of something, this is one way. You can actually take a picture of your picture. If you're already home and you don't have the actual plant, take a picture of the picture that you took of the plant, and it'll do the same thing. I do this with birds too. My bird knowledge isn't as much as it should be, but there are bird apps. I think I've heard of Merlin, which allows you to put a picture of a bird in, and it'll map it out and identify what kind of bird it is. So I tend to use that, especially if I'm shooting birds in other countries that are not very familiar. And so that's it. That's all I have to say tonight. My workflow in Photoshop, I use two plugins. One is Topaz Labs. They have denoise, gigapixel, and sharpen. They're simply amazing. I run almost every image that I work with. I always open it up and run denoise on it first to remove any noise. And not only removes noise, but it also will identify areas that could use some sharpening and will sharpen parts of the image that should be sharpened and remove the noise that from the area that should be removed. So if you're interested, if you visit my website, I have a store page, and if you click on the link to Topaz there, I get a ribbon for sending somebody over to Topaz. So you could help me out. I want to get that ribbon. And of course, Hunt's Photo is going to have some outstanding offers for you. I believe that included in that will be a discount on the Loom Cube Panel Go, which I use extensively on doing flower photography. And I think that'll do it for me. So I am going to hit escape, and there it is. And I will stop my share and open to any questions you might have.
To say that the chat was very silent. I think you gave so much information and you promised more, which is very exciting. People didn't put in any questions.
Well, I was either so clear on what I was saying, or I just confused everybody and they want to go home. Well, they're home already.
Let's see. Actually, first comment is tremendous presentation. Thanks so much. And somebody else said so much information.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. And again, my goal here is not to make you remember everything I talked. It's in order to give you some ideas on what to think about when you're out there. Try to, if you pick up one thing that I talked about tonight, you say, okay, I'm going to try that. I'd be happy. You don't need to remember everything. And again, my notes will support some of what I talked about, but I hope I gave you at least one idea that you'll want to go out and try in the field or at home. Photographing flowers at home is a lot of fun, and you save a lot of gas. You help the environment. You're not driving anywhere.
Good plan. You had I call it an alligator clip thing that you were using to hold some of your dry flowers in the inside present.
Yeah, it's called a plamp. A plamp. That's what they call it. Yeah.
And where do you get those clamps?
I'm sure Hunt's has them. You just have to ask for them.
Okay.
You got to be careful though, because I first bought that. I went to a garden out in Pennsylvania, and it had just rained, and there were these beautiful tulips. Some of the tulips I showed you in the presentation were from there. And I said, but it was windy. So I said, oh, I'll use my plamp to hold the flower in place. And I put the plamp on the stem of the tulip, and the tulip went like, bent it right in half. I said, oh shit, I'm in trouble. So you got to be careful what plants, but if you're outdoors and you have a flower with a pretty firm stem, and you put a plamp on there, and you can put one on the flower stem, and then the other end you can attach to your tripod, and it'll reduce the amount of wind, because now you're holding it steady. But you got to be careful what flowers you do that with, because some of those flowers that have these very soft and delicate stems, they'll just break, because it's it's really hard to open up. It's very firm.
Okay. I was wondering, because it looked like in one of the pictures, like it had an area that was open, that you didn't have to clamp on it, but you
yeah, that might be a possibility too. Yeah.
So that would reduce the movement a little bit, but not quite as much, but you wouldn't kill the plant.
Yeah, you don't want to kill the plants. And again, the challenge outdoors is the wind, and if need be, you raise your ISO, you raise your shutter speed, make your shutter speed fast, and freeze the action. I do a lot of landscape photography, and I like to get wildflowers in the foreground and mountains in the distance, and those flowers are moving. So I have got to, sometimes what I'll do is I'll take one shot of the flowers at a high shutter speed and high ISO, and then take a second shot of the mountains in the distance at a lower ISO and slower shutter speed, and then blend them together, similar to what you do in with focus stacking. So you can then, in post-processing in Photoshop, you can blend those together, use the flower shot from one and the mountain shot from the other image, and blend them together. And at least increase the quality of the image, the top part of the image where the mountain is. So
somebody says here, I'm going to photograph my garden flowers. Thanks for the inspiration.
Oh, thank you.
Somebody else, looking forward to the notes, and thanks you for a great presentation. So I think you really answered so many questions. You really did a great presentation.
Oh, thank you, Nancy.
It was really nice seeing exactly how you positioned the lights. I mean, it's just tremendous in terms of, I've thought about doing inside. I tend to do outside fight with the wind pictures and shadows. So it would be nice to do that. And it was really helpful seeing the way you set it up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, outdoors is fun too, and if you bring a friend with you, the reflectors can also be a wind block. And you can use that to block the wind too, and kind of minimize that. So there's all kinds of tricks out there. But yeah, if it's a windy day, sometimes you're better off photographing birds, because then they're doing a lot of flying, right?
Exactly. And you can compensate with a real high high speed.
Yep.
Okay, let's see, 2 new messages. Let's see what that is. Yeah, fantastic presentation. Thank you, David. And yeah, it's just, I think everybody is overwhelmed, but I think they're excited to look at your things that you're sending out to us. I assume you're going to send it to us and then we'll distribute it.
Yeah, I'll send it to you, Nancy. I think I saw your email.
Sure, we definitely have that. That'd be great.
And then you could forward it to your members.
We will do that. Usually we forward it to everybody that participated in the in our evening presentation.
Okay.
So, all right, guys, it's your last chance to give us a comment or a question. And if not, we'll just look forward to getting the information from you. Mary, do you have anything to add? Mary, I think she might have disappeared for a moment.
No, just trying to unmute.
Oh, okay.
I just really enjoyed this, David. Thank you so much. It's really cool.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the kind words.
And I really enjoyed the ideas for backgrounds outdoors.
Yeah.
I use a green cloth to kind of drape over the plants behind what I want to photograph. And you gave even more ideas for that. So that's great.
Yeah, another idea, a friend of mine, when I first started photographing, I met a gentleman who was very experienced. And what he would do, he had a piece of bark. And he would take the piece of bark with him and he'd use the bark of a tree as his background. So you can use, you can use photographs, you can use, material. Obviously, I think you want it to look natural. So unless, of course, you're looking for the lower high key look, and that's a different story. But yeah, you can use other natural materials, and or if you don't have bark, take a picture of bark and make a print. Bring that with you.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things you can do.
Yeah, I really like the out of focus flowers or colors that you took out in the wild and printed those out. I thought that was a really neat idea.
Okay, good. Yeah, just pay attention to the backgrounds, because I really should have more pictures of bad backgrounds. I've put that in there because that really, that tells the story. When you have a picture and you got a distracting background with bright spots and other leaves and half of flowers, and it's distracting. So, if you want to get a natural photograph of a group of flowers, it's more challenging because now you've got to deal with all these other different elements and to merge them together to create a very harmonious arrangement it's challenging.
It definitely is. So let's see, human photography link. Mary, somebody asked if Noah posted the women photography link.
I didn't see it, no. So we can contact Noah and send it out to everyone here. We'll do that also.
Okay, and I will add to that the link that I have for David's article in NAPA. That was about the conservation photography.
Yes.
That's an old one.
It is 2015, but it was still very good and it had some great pictures. So I didn't see any reason to turn my nose up at it because of its age.
Yeah, I started doing it. I hooked up with a woman who was working for the State Department. And at the time she was assigned to Pakistan. And this woman is she's just amazing. She's been in the State Department and has worked all over the world. And she was in Afghanistan, really dangerous areas. But she was in Pakistan and she had a project where she was trying to share with the people of Pakistan what America is like. So I was sending her photographs of different areas in the United States, and then they would put them in their magazine that would go out to, I don't know who it went to, whether it was just the diplomats or people in there, the government, or whether it went to the general public. But so, I mean, that kind of got me thinking, about what a photograph can do.
Yeah.
I don't think we're any friendlier with Pakistan as a result, but it was a
Yeah.
good try.
Mhm. Definitely.
And she's
And what- Go ahead.
no, I'm done. Yeah.
Okay. And Mary, I think that if anybody goes to Hunt's, their website, and looks for their, the area on the website where they do their shows and presentations and stuff like that, I'm sure there'll be a link there because they're promoting it. So
Yes, and
think-
also Noah said that he would be sending us the
Right.
specials
Exactly.
deals that they have, and usually he sends us a few of their presentations that are going to be happening. So we
That's
will
true.
pass it on also to everybody.
Very true. Okay. Well, thanks again, David. It was
Okay, my
an
pleasure.
awesome presentation, and I enjoyed meeting you, and hopefully you appreciated that our club really loved your thing, and it
Well-
was so comprehensive that they really couldn't come up with many questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I hope to be back again.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
Do you do critiques at all? Okay.
Okay, well, it depends. If you're looking for somebody to score the pictures and assign winners, no.
No, we
If you're
don't.
looking for somebody to give critiques, I wouldn't mind doing that.
Okay,
But I
Mm.
found the situations where I was, doing judging and giving awards out.
Yeah.
It got pretty ugly. I mean, especially on Zoom, because you can see people typing nasty notes on the bottom. And so
Jeez.
really, I mean, the last time I did it was a couple of weeks ago, and I did it because I wanted to do somebody a favor. Because I hadn't judged in 2 years, and they asked me, I said, well, for you, I'll do it. And I was judging, and I made a comment about this topic, and I can't repeat what the guy said, but he called me a stupid effing something or other that I
Wow.
didn't know what I was, and it was loud as can be. Everybody heard it. So that reminded me why I stopped judging. But I would, if you don't want scores and awards, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, well, they'll be in touch.
Okay.
We've eliminated those. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night. Okay. Good job.